The Australian Financial Review.
Sometimes the best thing you can do to fast-track your career is to quit. Dropping out didn't hurt Bill Gates, didn't hurt Steve Jobs, and it definitely didn't hurt Mark Zuckerberg.
If I get through this speech today, it'll be the first time I actually finish something here at Harvard.
And when Vince Allen quit his PhD research into a new type of solar cell, some people might have thought he was wasting his potential and the 2 years of work he'd already put in. But the thing about quitting a PhD is that you are no longer compelled to publish your findings. And for someone like Vince, who'd made a technological breakthrough in solar panels, keeping that intellectual property private could be the most important business decision he ever made. Some of Australia's richest and most famous business people seem to think so, judging by the rate at which they are subscribing for shares in Vince's solar startup. Collectively, they're determined to manufacture here in Australia and wean the nation off its addiction to Chinese solar panels. And as for his PhD supervisor, she didn't hold a grudge when he quit. She now works for Vince's company.
Hi, I'm Vincent Allen, co-founder and CEO of Sundrive. We're a solar technology startup developing more efficient, cheaper solar cells.
Everyone knows we need to do something about climate change, but what's not clear is how do we fix it?
Low emissions technologies.
There is net zero modelling.
Change is coming whether you like it or not.
Change isn't just coming, it's already underway. We're living through a massive industrial revolution where just about everything we do is going to have to change in less than 3 decades. Empires are going to crumble and fortunes are going to be made. I'm Peter Kerr from the Carbon Challenge team at the Australian Financial Review, and this is Tech Zero. It's a podcast about the big green ideas that could get us to net zero and the inspiring people who are putting their heart and soul into making them work. Professor Alison Lennon has watched plenty of bright young students come through the School of Photovoltaic Engineering at the University of New South Wales. But in her 16 years there, few students have taken on a more ambitious project than the one Vince Allen based his PhD on.
When Vince started his project, I knew it was a challenging project. A number of companies have looked to try and solve it before.
Vince wanted to find a way to replace the silver in solar panels with copper. Silver's about 87 times more expensive than copper, but Vince's motivation was not just to make the panels cheaper. He figured that a copper-based cell could also convert more sunlight into electricity. Alison was Vince's PhD supervisor, and she knew that many people had failed trying to solve this exact puzzle. But she also knew it was a critical thing for the industry to fix. The solar industry consumed about 11% of global silver production last year, and the International Energy Agency reckons solar manufacturers will be gobbling up 30% of annual silver supply by 2030, assuming the world stays on a net zero pathway. The way Alison sees it, a shortage of silver, or extremely high prices for silver, could be the thing that stops the world getting to net zero.
The industry's dependence on using silver could ultimately limit the ability for PV to scale to terawatt levels. It is effectively a roadblock that needs to be solved. It's almost critical for the PV industry, I think, to be able to solve this problem.
Copper is famous for being a conductive metal, so the idea of swapping out silver for copper might not sound that revolutionary, but the industry just hadn't been able to nail it.
At the time, there were a number of technical challenges required in implementing copper to solar cells. One of the challenges of using copper is getting the copper to stick to the surface of the cell. And essentially, a big part of the PhD was to address that.
All students are quite different, like in terms of what they need in supervision. Vince was always very self-driven and resilient, and he did work extremely hard, and he was very determined. And actually those are the marks that you really need for a research scientist. It's not necessarily about being Einstein or the world's brightest person. A lot of it is intuition and persistence.
But Vince was also impatient, in a healthy way, of course. At one stage, he and his mate Dave cleared out his home garage in the Sydney suburb of Maroubra. because Vince didn't want to wait for the university to get around to providing him with the equipment he needed for the next stage of his research.
The very early proof of concepts was sort of more at university in the labs, but then sort of scaling it, making bigger solar cells, that required, new equipment that the university didn't have at the time. There was obviously two options. One was, try and build equipment in the university. Usually that involves, outsourcing the designing and the building of the equipment. A lot of the time there's, a 6-month turnaround, and then you get the equipment and there's problems, you got to send the designs back. But the other option, which is what ended up happening, is myself and Dave just started building these very basic rudimentary equipment in my garage, and through that process I was able to iterate much faster than what I think I would have if I would have gone through the university with the equipment development.
Was that in Maroubra?
Correct. That was in my apartment garage in Maroubra, yes.
So you parked on the street for a few years?
Correct, yes. So it was only a single car garage, so that was that was sort of the lab at night and over the weekends.
Everyone could see how committed Vince was to his project, so plenty of people were surprised when he quit his PhD. But the thing was, he wasn't quitting his project. Far from it. That shift out of the university laboratory and into his garage symbolised a lot of the thoughts Vince was having at the time.
When I started my PhD, or even when I started uni, learning about solar, I never went into it with the intention of starting a company. It was just, I'd probably say sort of halfway through the PhD, it just, I started to think about it more and more. Can I accelerate the research faster by starting a company than continuing through university? And that thought just became more and more frequent. Probably say, 2014 was that's when I sort of at least mentally made the decision. I think I can have the greatest contribution by starting Sundrive with my co-founder David, and to this day I haven't really, looked back on that decision.
It's now 8 years since Vince quit his PhD and founded Sundrive with his mate David Hu. The work has shifted from Vince's garage to a factory in Kirrawee, halfway between Sydney and Wollongong. We're going into a room that's called the silver-free zone. What does that mean?
This is where we make our solar cells.
Tech Zero went for a walk through the factory to try and understand exactly how Vince had got copper to stick on a solar cell. Now, the Sundrive team are fanatical about keeping dust out of the lab where they make the cells. We had to dress head to toe in white plastic outfits, which almost looked like a hazmat suit. Then we had to walk through a room about the size of 2 phone boxes, where we were blasted with air for 30 seconds.
Okay, we are inside the air shower.
Push the door.
Wow, we've made it through the air shower.
Welcome to the engine room of Sundrive.
Vince didn't give away all of his trade secrets about how he made the copper stick, but an important part of the process is to imprint some fine grooves onto the cell. That process is called patterning, and those grooves are where the copper gets held in position.
These grooves are of the order of about 10 microns, and that's about a tenth the width of a human hair.
I assumed that the day Vince successfully got copper to stick on a solar cell would be among the most memorable and triumphant moments of his life. As a journalist, I was expecting the sort of light bulb moment we see in Hollywood films, with high fives all round and champagne corks popping. But the truth is, it was more banal than that. Research is an iterative game, and breakthroughs happen at small scale and then swiftly need to be tested at a larger scale or under different circumstances. There's rarely time to stop and admire the view. You've just got to keep putting one foot in front of the other.
Once I got the copper to stick, it was just understand what it actually really means. Once you actually do see, the promise in something, it's just trying to understand, so what can it actually do? What can it unlock? What's the next steps? Back then it would have been on a tiny little, solar cell. It was really just, how do we, what's the next steps required?
Well, one key moment that I can recall is we'd been trying to solve this problem of how do you make sure that copper stays on the cell. And so, we'd looked at a few papers and he tried this method, and he came back one day and showed me this solar cell. These are very small cells, not the big ones that they're making now at Sundrive. and showed me how the copper would actually stick. And I thought, oh, wow, that's really good. Like it was quite impressive because I'd seen a lot of failures. Like it's been a problem that I, within my research group, had been trying to address for some time. And so, yeah, I was very impressed.
They'd be good poker players, wouldn't they? They'd solved a puzzle that had bedeviled their industry for years. But hey, it's just all in a day's work. Vince led us over to a table where one of his cells was sat beside a standard solar cell. The standard cell reminded me a bit of those pinstripe suits that classic Wall Street bankers wear. It was blue and it had thick whitish grey lines down it. The Sundrive cell was also mostly blue, but it had orange lines instead of the thick white lines. The orange lines were the copper, and they were much thinner than the silver lines on the other cell. They were also more numerous. The weight of copper in Vince's panel was about 35% lower than the weight of silver in the other panel. So Vince is using less metal, and the metal he's using is 87 times cheaper. But as Vince explains, it's not just about cost. There are many other reasons why he reckons his copper solution is better.
But what is a little bit more nuanced is why copper can actually lead to higher efficiency. So wherever there's blue, that is the good absorbing portion of the solar cell. So if you can make your electrode lines narrower, that means you're shading the solar cell less with metal and more light can go through. But if you can make your electrode lines narrower, what that also means is you can allow for more of them on your surface. And if you have more of them on your surface, then the distance for an electron to be collected in one of those lines, the distance that the electron has to travel is less. So that means it's less resistive. Essentially, what we've been able to do is make the solar cell less resistive and absorb more light at the same time.
The electrode lines on a panel, should we think of those as like the arterial roads that allow the electricity to travel from where it's captured to where we want it to go?
Correct. So the spacing between these lines are about 1.5 millimeters for the silver one.
Yep.
For the copper one, it's about 1 mil. So you can see there's actually more lines, a higher density of lines. So that means the electrons don't have to travel as far, in the lateral direction to be collected.
So you've got more of the arteries that carry the current, and you also have more of the blue cells absorbing areas
of the solar cell. And then the other benefit is if you were to compare pure silver with pure copper, silver is actually more conductive. But when making solar cells, traditional solar cells, it's not actually pure silver they use silver paste. So there's basically a whole bunch of other additives that are mixed in with the silver particles that actually lower the conductivity of the silver below that of copper. So we use pure copper, which is more conductive than the silver paste. So that means, again, less resistance.
Sundrive are not yet putting their cells into the sort of panels you can buy and put on your roof. That's probably 18 to 24 months away. But they've already got some serious street cred, and that's partly due to what happened in September 2021. When they posted one of their cells to the Institute for Solar Energy Research in Hamelin, Germany. Now that institution is more commonly known as the ISFH. They're a not-for-profit, and they're a really trusted source of independent analysis on solar panel performance. The Institute reported back that under their testing, Sundrive's cell had converted 25.54% of received sunlight into power. That's a new world record. If you've got solar panels on your roof, they're probably converting about 20% of sunlight into power.
We were, over the moon when we first, when we got those results back, and it was just, all the hard work that we put in. We still have a very long way to go, but it certainly is a proud milestone along our journey.
How did you actually hear the news? Were you in Germany?
No, so all done electronically by email. It was in the middle of the night.
And it literally came as an email?
Correct.
Did it have flashing lights saying new world record?
That would have been nice, but no. Yeah. When we hit the world record efficiency in September of last year, we had a team of 11, basically operating in a self-built lab in a warehouse in the middle of the Sutherland Shire. And the company that held the previous world record is sort of one of the solar giants in the industry. Huge overseas solar manufacturer with 50,000 employees, revenue of like 10 billion, a market cap pretty close to 100 billion. So that was a very very proud moment for the team.
Records are made to be broken, and 25.54% did not stand as the world record for long. Some of Sundrive's rivals have inched higher than that, and Sundrive themselves have done better too. In March, the ISFH recorded a Sundrive cell at 26.07% efficiency. And in September they went better again, at 26.41%. That means they've improved almost a full percentage point in just 1 year.
We have progressively improved our copper technology, so making those electrode lines thinner, making them more conductive.
Some very notable investors have bought into the Sundrive story. Australia's third richest man, Mike Cannon-Brookes, is on board through his private investment company Grok Ventures. The venture capital firm Blackbird Ventures, which counts the Tesla chairman Robin Denham as a partner, is also on board. And those investors seem to care more about the world record Sundrive are setting than the fact Vince didn't complete his PhD. Alison, do you reckon it's ironically a benefit for Sundrive as a business that Vince didn't finish his PhD? Because had he finished it, presumably he would have had to publish a paper or some sort of public showing of his work, whereas all of his advances, because the PhD wasn't completed, does that all sort of stay in-house, ironically, and benefit corporately?
Yes, it's a very interesting point, because as a PhD, you have to publish a thesis, and that thesis, although it can remain confidential for a period of time, ultimately it has to be public. So by not completing his PhD, it did avoid that issue.
So dropping out might be the smartest business decision Vince ever made.
It might have. I mean, if he actually stayed to do his PhD, there would have been pressure to publish in some way. It would have also meant he would have been later going to business, and the PV industry moves very, very fast. The 2 years he spent writing a thesis, and a lot of PhD students will take 3 to 4 months, sometimes 6 months to write their thesis, like it's a book. So it might have been fortuitous that he was able to get started on Sundrive earlier.
One of the big decisions facing Vince and the Sundrive team is whether to mass-produce panels here in Australia or go abroad. And this has been a recurring dilemma for all solar entrepreneurs that have come out of Australia in the last couple of decades. Take, for instance, Dr. Shi Zhengrong. Having learned from the best at the University of New South Wales, he took his solar ideas back to China, where he commercialised them, partly because the labour and energy was cheaper there. In 2001, he founded a solar panel manufacturing company in China called Suntech, and it quickly became one of the world's biggest manufacturers. By 2008, Forbes magazine estimated Dr. Shi's stake in Suntech at almost $3 billion. Dr. Shi and Suntech were eventually bought undone in 2013 by the trend that they helped start, the mass production of panels in China. Now that mass production cut profit margins down to wafer-thin levels, and it wiped out lots of panel manufacturers inside China and outside. But China still dominates. An estimated 80% of the panels installed in Australia come from China. Energy Minister Chris Bowen was warning that China's market share would soon rise to 95%. If that comes to pass, it's going to give China enormous influence over the world's ability to decarbonise, and the price the world will pay to decarbonise. Vince wants Sundrive to buck this trend.
We are determined. We do see the potential, and it is our intention to manufacture in Australia. Just so much opportunity for Australia to be a solar manufacturing powerhouse.
Vince insists that this is not a case of parochialism or emotion overriding commercial logic. And after this short break, he'll explain why he reckons Australia can genuinely thrive as a solar panel producer. Over the past decade, Australia lost its car manufacturing industry and plenty of other manufacturing jobs too. But Vince reckons Australia can realistically aim to become one of the world's lowest cost producers of solar panels.
So 10 years ago, costs were heavily dominated by labour, land and equipment. But due to the rapid advances in automation, costs are more dominated today by fundamental cost factors, things like material inputs, electricity and transportation. And Australia has an advantage in each one of those three things. As I mentioned earlier, Australia is in the top three global reserves for every major mineral material needed to make a solar panel. In a net zero world, heavy industries and manufacturing, including the manufacturing of solar panels, is going to occur in countries where clean electricity is cheap, not where fossil fuel electricity is cheap. So a lot of manufacturing today is predominantly in Asia, in China, in India, because fossil fuel electricity is cheap. But that sort of mentality or thinking doesn't quite work in a net zero world. And then from a transportation perspective, so if you were to buy a solar panel in Australia, about 15% of the cost is just getting it here to Australia. So with local, with onshore processing, with the local supply chain, there's definitely an advantage. There are a lot of countries all around the world that are, competing more and more in this space. But we do see with the right policies, Australia can be a global solar manufacturing powerhouse. We have the need. We have the fastest growing rooftop market in the world. Australia is also going to be home to the 5 largest solar farms by the end of this decade. We have the people. Many of the world's top solar executives, scientists, engineers were trained at Australian universities.
It's 2 decades since Dr. Xi took his ideas back to China to commercialise them. But he doesn't seem to think that Vince's idea about manufacturing in Australia is crazy. In fact, he's one of Sundrive's biggest investors.
We're aiming for end of 2023, early 2024 to actually start to have panels ready for deployment that can go on people's roofs and things like that. Once we do have that market entry capacity to basically just rapidly scale that, and by the end of this decade, our plan is to get to multi-gigawatt scale production. We do plan to bring to market the most efficient commercially available panel at a price point that's around 20 to 30% cheaper than other high efficiency panels on the market. That's phase 1 of our strategy. Certainly long term, we would aim to be less than that 30 cents per watt. But yeah, to really get to that ultra low cost scenario, what you really need is scale. And obviously we are going from 0 to that. We need to think, obviously, in terms of a company strategically, how we get there.
So people who listen to this podcast come away from it thinking, this Sundrive thing sounds awesome. How do I invest in it? Can they?
I wasn't expecting that one. The truth of it is, in terms of venture capital-backed solar startups, it's probably got one of the highest failure rates of any sort of startup category or anything like that. So one of the very important things that we need to do in the next 18 to 24 months is all the rigorous testing that's required. So, if you put a solar panel, on your roof or in a solar farm, it needs to last at least 25 years. Before any sort of mum and dad can invest in Sundrive, we really want to make sure we, get everything right and, the testing and the production, et cetera, et cetera. We're very fortunate to have, a really strong investor base behind us. When we raised our first sort of institutional-led investment round, this was in 2018, and that was led by Blackbird Ventures and Grok Ventures. The purpose of that round was really to show that we can make a full-size solar cell that is actually more efficient than a comparative silver-based solar cell. And once we were able to do that, we raised another round of investment, and that was in August of 2020, again by Blackbird and Grok Ventures. And I can't say too much yet, but we are also in the process of finalising another round of investment.
Alison, do you reckon if in 5 years' time Vince turned up back at the Uni of New South Wales with $1 billion IPO of a solar panel company, that the uni might say, okay, that's sufficient for your PhD. Okay, yes, here you go. Here's your certificate.
I'm not exactly sure how PhDs are awarded on business. There's always opportunities for universities to recognise outstanding achievements through various honorary degrees and so forth.
I'm just trying to help a brother out. I'm just trying to get him this PhD. Come on, man, we've got to get this thing.
Well, UNSW is actually a shareholder of Sundrive. So
is that right?
If Sundrive does well,
Fantastic.
UNSW also does well.
How did that come about?
It was tied into some of the IP arrangements. Obviously, during the PhD, there was IP that was developed, and we don't have massive cash reserves to pay royalties and things like that. So, we came to an arrangement that worked quite well for us. So for them, they have a small stake in Sundrive.
I don't get the sense that Vince lies awake at night regretting his decision to not complete his PhD. But symbolically, he got a pretty amazing endorsement from his former PhD supervisor, Alison, last year in November, when she joined Sundrive as the company's chief scientist. At the time you were supervising Vince, you were supervising half a dozen other students. And I imagine over your career, the number you would have supervised would be much higher. Is Vince the only one that you have followed into business?
Yes, the only one I've followed into business. He's not the only student who has started their own company, but he's certainly the only one I've followed into business. Yeah.
From the outside, that looks like a big endorsement for what Vince has created.
When I look at the situation now, the technology has advanced. It's quite mature in some sense, and there's new challenges for it. And the challenges are not necessarily technical challenges like how do you design the physics of this solar cell. The challenges are more, well, how do we make enough solar so we can actually, make this transition to clean energy worldwide? And those are not necessarily challenges that you can solve at university. They're challenges like deciding what materials you use for your solar modules, how you manufacture. Do you manufacture all your modules in China, or do we try and manufacture them in different countries around the world so we can actually share the resources around the world? So when Vince and Dave asked me if I'd join them at Sundrive, I had actually been thinking at that time of potentially looking for something different. The reason, even if I was going to move out of university, that I think going to Sundrive was a very good idea, is I think the problem that Sundrive are trying to solve is actually a really important problem for not just Australia, but it's an important problem for the industry in general.
I did sort of promise Alison I would, finish the PhD, but
is this a liberating experience hearing your PhD
yeah,
supervising?
well, I did sort of promise Alison I would, finish the PhD, but now that she's chief scientist, maybe that gives me a bit more time to
we've got it on tape.
Go back and. But yeah, at some point I would like to do it purely just more so, I've started something, I'd like to finish it, but right now, all of my attention and focus is in Sundrive, and to this day I feel very fortunate to be in a position to do what I do without a PhD.
To me, whether he finished the PhD or not is sort of not a really big issue, right? So I don't have a feeling that you can only be successful in business if you have a PhD. In fact, in some businesses, having a PhD is sometimes a bit of a detriment because the period a student will spend, maybe 3 to 4 years working, if they're working very independently and not having to take much instruction. When they come out of their PhD, it's sometimes quite hard for them to adapt to working as one person in a team, in a company. No, I didn't actually see it as a problem. I must admit, and I probably still do, think it's very unlikely that Vince will go back to finish his PhD, but I don't think it matters, right?
Thanks for listening to Tech Zero. If you're interested in solar power, check out our 2 previous episodes on solar. The first one published on June 16. It's called Cheap Solar's Moment in the Sun. Then on September 26, we took a look at concentrated solar and how you store it. That episode's called How to Make the Sun Shine After Dark. Join us next week when we meet the Finnish entrepreneur who's convinced Australia's biggest company to back his plan to bring wind power back to the global shipping industry. This podcast was hosted and written by me, Peter Kerr. It was produced and edited by Lapfan with technical production by Cormac Lally. The executive producer is Fiona Buffini. If you like the show and want to hear more, follow us on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts. And consider rating or reviewing us, as it helps us find others. At the Financial Review, we investigate the big stories about markets, business, and power. To subscribe to the Financial Review, go to afr.com/subscribe. And if you want to get in touch with us here, you can email at techzero@afr.com. Tech Zero is part of the Financial Review's Carbon Challenge franchise.
The Australian Financial Review.